Gerard Schaefer Jr. was born on March 26, 1946 in Neenah, Wisconsin, a city of approximately 27,000 people located along the southwestern shore of Lake Winnebago. He was the first of 3 children born to Gerard Sr. and Doris. His father was a traveling salesman while his mother was a homemaker. From the very beginning, the household was struck by tension and instability. Gerard Sr. was a chronic alcoholic whose work as a traveling salesman kept him away from home for long stretches at a time. But when he was home, he was verbally abusive toward his wife and children, and his eldest son in particular bore the brunt of that hostility. Schaefer later stated that he believed his father resented him, that he was never good enough in his father's eyes, and that his father openly favored his sister over both him and his younger brother. This sense of being permanently singled out and diminished within his own home would remain a defining wound for Schaefer for the rest of his life. In contrast, Schaefer was extremely close to his mother, who was described as fiercely and almost aggressively protective of all 3 of her children. The family did not stay in Wisconsin for long. Senior's job required frequent relocation, and the family moved first to Nashville, Tennessee, then relocated again to Atlanta, Georgia, where Schaefer attended the private Marist Academy. These constant moves had a major effect on Schaefer's social development. He never had enough time in any single place to form lasting friendships, and the instability reinforced his tendency to isolate himself. In 1960, when Schaefer was 14 years old, the family made one final move to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where they settled permanently. It was in Fort Lauderdale that Schaefer would attend high school and develop the compulsions that would define the rest of his life. He enrolled at St. Thomas Aquinas High School, a Catholic institution. On paper, he was a reasonably well-rounded student. His teachers considered him bright and promising. He was a member of the varsity football team during his sophomore and junior years and was also an accomplished golfer. To outside observers, he appeared to be a typical teenage boy with a strong interest in outdoor activities such as hunting, fishing, and exploring. In fact, he once stated that he had aspirations of one day becoming a forest ranger, but beneath the surface, something was going wrong. By the time he was a teenager, Schaefer had begun developing erotic fantasies specifically directed at women he deemed, quote, worthy of his contempt. These fantasies quickly devolved into action when he began spying on female neighbors and classmates. A former classmate, Barbara Krolik, later said, "I can't remember him being friends with any of the guys. He was always on the outside looking in. As a matter of fact, the only thing I really remember is that I always had to tuck my skirt under my legs because he would practically stand on his head to look up a girl's skirt." Another former classmate described him simply as weird, while a third recalled that he was a loner who would talk to himself. Alongside the voyeurism, Schaefer began combining cross-dressing, sadomasochism, and erotic asphyxia. He would engage in these activities in deep, isolated woods, tying himself to trees and remaining there, suspended by his own bindings until he gratified himself. He later acknowledged that these activities increased steadily in both frequency and intensity, eventually dominating his mind basically the entire day. By his mid to late teens, these thoughts moved past himself, and he wanted to inflict them on women. Schaefer graduated from high school in June 1964. After graduation, he briefly took a job as a fishing guide in the Florida Everglades before enrolling in college. In September 1964, he enrolled at Broward Community College in Fort Lauderdale as a social studies major, though he would later switch to education. His performance at Broward was average. He got by without distinguishing himself, and he later admitted spending far more time hunting in the Everglades than studying. During this period, Schaefer made a decision that sheds significant light on his state of mind. He applied for entry to St. John's Seminary with the intention of becoming a Catholic priest. He had been a practicing Catholic throughout his upbringing, attending daily mass for years. The seminary rejected his application, concluding that he lacked sufficient depth of faith. Rather than reflect on the assessment, Schaefer almost immediately decided the entire rejection was the result of Catholic mind control, and he abandoned the church entirely. This pattern of redirecting blame rather than absorbing criticism would become a hallmark of how he processed failure for the rest of his life. At Broward, he also became involved with a traveling ensemble called Sing Out 66, a patriotic conservative singing troupe that was explicitly positioned as a moral rearmament alternative to the hippie movement. Through his involvement with the group, Schaefer met a young woman from Boston named Martha Fogg, with whom he began a romantic relationship during a summer of touring. The relationship stalled when Schaefer contracted measles and was unable to accompany the group on a European tour, during which he and Martha temporarily lost touch. Around this same period, Schaefer made a startling confession to a creative writing professor at Broward. He said that he experienced violent urges toward women and a compulsion to kill. He told the professor he wanted to join the army because, as he put it, he, quote, would like to kill things. He described escalating behavior that had moved from shooting cows on local farms to beheading livestock with a machete and then performing explicit acts with their carcasses. The professor, alarmed, referred him to a college counselor. Schaefer met with the counselor and was assessed, but no meaningful intervention resulted. The counselor's report noted that his psychological disorganization is severe and his frustration level low, but Schaefer was not removed from campus, not flagged for extended psychiatric care, and not prevented from continuing his education. He was also, during the same stretch, privately disclosing his urges to a girlfriend he was seeing at the time. He described his fantasies to her, telling her about a female neighbor he had observed changing clothes through her window, and about another neighbor who sunbathed in her own backyard, both of whom he was fixated on and fantasized about harming. The relationship ended when his girlfriend broke up with him over what she had heard. He responded by stalking her as she began dating other men before eventually losing interest. After completing his sophomore year at Broward Community College, Schaefer applied for and was accepted on scholarship to Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, where he enrolled in 1968 with the goal of earning a Bachelor of Arts in Education. Shortly after enrolling at FAU, he found himself in a predicament. His grades were too low to qualify for a student deferment from military service, and he received orders to report for an Army physical, which would have set him on a path toward deployment during the Vietnam War. He left a handwritten note in his dorm room indicating he intended to end himself, then fled the campus. His roommate found the note, searched the area, and eventually located Schaefer at a local shooting range the two frequented regularly. When pressed, Schaefer admitted immediately that the note wasn't truthful, that he wrote it to avoid having to report for his physical. He was subsequently referred for emergency psychiatric testing, which found no evidence of genuine harmful ideation. As a result of this evaluation, he received a Y1 deferment for mental, moral, or physical reasons, exempting him from the draft and allowing him to remain at the university. At FAU, Schaefer reconnected with Martha Fogg. Additionally, his parents' marriage had finally collapsed. After decades of seniors drinking, verbal abuse, and affairs, Doris had filed for divorce. Around the same time, Schaefer announced to his family that he and Martha were engaged. The two married in December 1968 and rented a property on Southwest 22nd Street in Fort Lauderdale. The marriage deteriorated quickly. Schaefer made incessant, relentless romantic demands, and his wife increasingly felt coerced and demeaned. He also spent the majority of his free time hunting and fishing, leaving her isolated at home. Martha later cited extreme cruelty as her grounds for divorce. In March 1969, Schaefer applied for a student teaching internship at Plantation High School. He was accepted and began the internship on September 23rd, teaching geography. By November 7th, he had been fired. The school had received numerous complaints from parents about his conduct in the classroom, specifically his refusal to accept guidance or correction from his supervising teachers, and his repeated attempts to impose his own moral and political views on students during what were supposed to be geography lessons. Supervisors described him as dismissive of authority and incapable of accepting criticism. After his firing, he applied for a new teaching position at a high school in Boca Raton, but was rejected. At this point, Schaefer had also begun confiding in various people about one of his newly forming beliefs. He was convinced that, quote, indecent women and prostitutes should be destroyed for the welfare of society. Around April 1970, Schaefer successfully applied for a second teaching internship. He began at Stranahan High School in Fort Lauderdale, again teaching geography. The results were even more dismal than his first attempt. Progress reports from his supervisors described him as extremely arrogant, and noted that he appeared to have very limited knowledge of the subject he was supposed to be teaching. His performance was so poor that the principal informed him, with approximately 2 weeks' notice, that the school was withdrawing him from the internship. He was formally let go in less than a month after starting. In that same month, Schaefer and Martha divorced. For a brief period following the separation, Schaefer entered into a short-lived relationship with a physically disabled woman he had encountered at a mental health clinic, where he had gone seeking psychiatric help. With 2 teaching terminations now on his record, Schaefer took a step back to examine his options. The teaching path was effectively closed to him as he had been blacklisted among local schools, and his failure to perform even in a supervised student teaching capacity made it unlikely he would obtain his certification. According to those who knew him at the time, he spent a significant period sitting at home, brooding over his failure as both a teacher and his rejection from being a priest. In his mind, the only logical path following his failures was a career in law enforcement. Before making that move, Schaefer vacationed for roughly a month in Europe and North Africa. When he returned to Florida, he took temporary employment as a security guard for the Wackenhut Corporation while he considered his next steps. In October 1970, while working as a security guard, Schaefer met a 19-year-old secretary named Teresa Dean. The two began dating and were soon engaged. Schaefer then graduated from Florida Atlantic University in August 1971 with a bachelor's degree in geography. Despite the degree, he still had no future in teaching. Schaefer and Teresa married 1 month after graduation in Fort Lauderdale. He claimed that this second marriage was substantially more compatible than his first. Teresa, by his account, was more willing to accommodate his intimate demands and shared his passion for fishing. Shortly after the marriage, Schaefer formally applied for a position with the Wilton Manors Police Department. On his application, he deliberately concealed his 2 teaching dismissals from the previous year. Instead, he falsely claimed to have spent 2 years working as a research assistant at Florida Atlantic University and stated that he had recently returned to the United States from Morocco. His prior work history was not verified, and he was accepted into the department. Schaefer completed the police academy at Broward Community College in December 1971 and began his 6-month probationary period with the department, graduating as a patrol officer at the end of the year at age 25. His tenure at the Wilton Manors Police Department was troubled from the start. The department's chief, Bernard Scott, later told reporters that Schaefer was as poorly suited for police work as he had been for the classroom. Fellow officers described Schaefer as badge happy, meaning he was obsessively fixated on the power and authority of his position rather than on the responsibilities that came with it. He issued traffic citations at an unusually and disproportionately high rate, even among officers known for strict enforcement. Chief Scott had already decided to fire Schaefer in March 1972. Before he could act, however, Schaefer received a formal commendation for his conduct during a drug house raid. This event forced Scott to delay firing Schaefer. A month or so later, he called Schaefer into his office for what he described as a come to Jesus talk. He told Schaefer explicitly that despite the commendation, his ongoing pattern of poor judgment and bad behavior was going to result in his termination, but that he was giving him one final chance. The next day, Scott learned that Schaefer had already applied for a job with the Broward County Sheriff's Office behind Scott's back. Scott fired him on the spot. However, Broward would later reject him after he failed their psychological evaluation. This exit, however, was only part of the story. The deeper reason for Schaefer's dismissal was his systematic misuse of departmental resources to pursue women. Supervisors discovered that Schaefer had been routinely stopping cars driven by women for minor traffic infractions, then running their license plates through the department's database to obtain their home addresses and personal contact information, which he then used to contact them and request dates. From then on, Schaefer applied to multiple law enforcement agencies in the area in quick succession. Scott's phone rang repeatedly as agencies conducted reference checks, and each time, Scott told them the same thing, that he would personally walk the streets in uniform before he would have Schaefer back on his force, and that they should not hire him. By late June 1972, Schaefer had been hired and was working as a Martin County Sheriff's deputy for just over 2 weeks. On the afternoon of Thursday, July 21st, Schaefer was on official patrol duty in Stuart, Florida, when he encountered 2 girls hitchhiking along a road near the town center. The girls were Nancy Ellen Trotter, 18, and Paula Sue Wells, 17, 2 friends from out of state who were vacationing in Florida. Schaefer pulled over and spoke to both girls from his patrol car in full uniform. He gave them a ride to their destination, and during the drive, he struck up a friendly conversation. In that conversation, he learned that neither girl was a Florida native and that both planned to continue hitchhiking the following day, this time to Jensen Beach. He expressed concern about their safety, delivered a brief lecture about the dangers of hitchhiking, specifically mentioning the possibility of being abducted or, quote, sold into white slavery. He then offered to personally drive them to Jensen Beach the following morning so they would not need to hitchhike. The girls accepted and agreed to meet him the next morning at a bandstand on East Ocean Boulevard at 9:15 a.m. The following morning, Schaefer arrived at the bandstand. He was out of uniform, wearing civilian clothes, and driving his personal vehicle rather than a patrol car. Both girls noticed this and expressed some level of concern. Schaefer told them he had been reassigned to undercover duty and therefore had to change clothes and vehicle. The teens accepted the explanation and got inside the car. As Schaefer drove, he again delivered a lecture about the dangers of hitchhiking. At some point during the drive, he told them he was going to show them an old Spanish fort located in the area near Hutchinson Island. Schaefer drove deeper and deeper into a remote, densely wooded area near the Indian River. He stopped the vehicle close to a dilapidated, abandoned shed that stood in a clearing among the trees, far from any road or people. At that point, he handcuffed both girls and gagged them. He then separated them and took one to a large cypress tree near the bank of the river. He tied her legs to the trunk just below the knees, pulling the rope taut to secure her against the bark. He then fashioned a noose around her neck, running it up to a branch above and fixing it so that the tension from the noose required her to stand on the exposed roots of the tree to keep herself safely elevated. He then returned to retrieve the second girl and took her to a separate tree a short distance away, where he bound her in an identical fashion. According to both victims' later testimony, Schaefer calmly stated that they were going to be violated and murdered. At that moment, his police radio crackled with an urgent dispatch order calling for him to return to the station immediately. He left both girls exactly as he had positioned them and walked back toward his vehicle. Before leaving, he told one of the girls that he was going to be far down the road and would return shortly. He explained he was going to meet briefly with the man he intended to sell them to. Trotter and Wells understood that if they slipped from the roots they were standing on, they would likely die. They could not simply thrash against their restraints or make sudden panicked movements. Instead, both girls began the slow process of working against their bindings, twisting and writhing against the ropes around their legs and the handcuffs, using their teeth on the gags, all while maintaining enough balance on the tree roots to keep the nooses from tightening. Eventually, both managed to free themselves. They moved through the dense wooded area separately, trying to find their way back toward any sign of civilization. A truck driver traveling on the highway near the forest came across Wells first, staggering through the undergrowth at the edge of the trees in clear distress. The driver brought her to the police station, arriving approximately 45 minutes before law enforcement would locate her friend. Schaefer returned to the forest approximately 2 hours after leaving to find both girls missing. He drove immediately home and called the station. When Sheriff Robert Crowder picked up, Schaefer told him, "I've done something very foolish. You'll be mad at me." He then proceeded to justify himself, saying that he just wanted to teach a lesson to 2 young hitchhikers about the dangers of accepting rides from strangers. He was then quoted saying that he had overdone the job. He told Crowder he had left the 2 girls in the general swampland area near Hutchinson Island close to the Indian River. Sheriff Crowder and Lieutenant Melvin Waldron drove immediately toward the area. As they slowed near the banks, they spotted a figure in the water, a young woman, hands still bound behind her back, partially gagged, kicking through the current with a flutter kick and fighting toward the bank. When the officers pulled over and waded toward her, they found Nancy Trotter, her jeans and blouse shredded in sections from her efforts to free herself. After the gag was removed from her mouth, she immediately asked about her friend. She was relieved to be told that Wells was already safe at the police station. Trotter was driven to the station, and both girls gave full accounts of their ordeal to Sheriff Crowder. Both girls formally identified Schaefer as their attacker, and gave a statement he had made to at least one of them after they had been secured to the trees. He said he could dig a hole right there in the woods and bury them both, and that nobody would ever find them. Crowder ordered his officers to file charges of false imprisonment and aggravated assault against him. Schaefer was dismissed from the Martin County Sheriff's Department and placed under arrest. Approximately 2 weeks after his arrest, Schaefer posted his $15,000 bail and was released. He then returned to the house he shared with his wife, Teresa. His wife and his in-laws noted no visible change in his behavior or demeanor in the days and weeks that followed. He obtained employment at a local quick-check grocery store and began waiting for his trial, which was scheduled for November 1972. To those around him, Schaefer simply stated that he was trying to warn two girls but went overboard, leading to his firing. What he left out was the part about threatening to assault and murder them. While viewed as embarrassing, his circle believed that he was simply facing the consequences for foolishness, not predation. On the evening of Wednesday, September 27th, roughly 9 weeks after his arrest, with his assault trial still more than a month away, Schaefer encountered two more teenage girls at an adult education center in Fort Lauderdale. Their names were Susan Carol Place, 17, and Georgia Mary Jessup, 16. The two were close friends and both had ended up at the center for different reasons. Place had transferred there partly because of bullying she had experienced at her regular school. Classmates had targeted her over a mild physical disability she had sustained after a bout of epilepsy that had left her with partial paralysis on the left side of her body. Jessup, by contrast, had run into disciplinary and attendance issues that resulted in her transfer to the alternative program. Schaefer had apparently been attending the same adult education center. He had introduced himself to both girls as Jerry Shepard, a man from Colorado who was planning to head back home after a vacation trip to Mexico. With Jessup, he appears to have cultivated a specific connection around her interests of reincarnation and extrasensory perception. With Place, who loved music and played guitar, he found common ground through her passion for playing. He did not come across as threatening or predatory, but rather as an older, interesting, slightly worldly man who took genuine interest in both girls as individuals. On the afternoon of September 27th, Place's mother Lucille arrived home to her Fort Lauderdale residence to find Susan in her bedroom tidying it up while Jessup and Schaefer sat nearby. Susan told her mother that the three of them were going to the beach together to hang out and play guitar. Lucille later described the encounter with Schaefer, who introduced himself as Jerry, as strange. First off, there was the obvious age difference, but weirdly, he consistently reassured her that he only had noble intentions. It was the unsolicited reassurance that bothered Lucille the most. Still, she had no specific grounds to stop her daughter from going. As Place gathered her things to leave, she had a brief exchange with her mother. She told Lucille that she would only be gone for a little while and that she would stay in contact. In hindsight, what should have set off alarm bells were the tears in her eyes. Lucille stated that she interpreted this as her daughter feeling guilt for wanting to run away from home. The girls left the home with Schaefer at approximately 8:45 p.m. on September 27, 1972. Before they drove away, Lucille wrote down the license plate number of the vehicle Schaefer was driving, a 1969 Datsun. When Place had not returned home or made contact after 4 days, Lucille called Jessup's mother, hoping to find that the girls were together and safe. Instead, she learned that Jessup had also not been seen or heard from since the evening of September 27th. Both mothers reported their daughters missing to the Oakland Park Police. Lucille gave investigators everything she had: the license plate number, the make and model of the vehicle, and a physical description of a man named Jerry Shepard. Investigators ran the plate, but the results came back linked to an entirely different make and model of vehicle, registered to a resident of St. Petersburg, Florida. This man bore no resemblance to the physical description of Jerry that Lucille provided, and when questioned, the man gave a firm and verifiable alibi. The discrepancy would not be explained or resolved until months later, when Lucille herself worked out the likely cause. Investigators had apparently misread the county prefix of the plate, checking it against Pinellas County records rather than Martin County. License plates in Martin County at the time began with the prefix 42, while Pinellas County plates began with just 4, a distinction that was easy to miss but catastrophic in its consequences. The person named Jerry Shepard, whose address was registered in Fort Lauderdale, was also tracked down and quickly cleared as a suspect. By early 1973, the disappearance of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup had become, to all outward appearances, a cold case. Both girls had been reported as runaways. There were no bodies, no confirmed crime scene, and no viable suspect. In December 1972, Schaefer appeared in court to face the charges stemming from the July abduction of Nancy Trotter and Paula Wells. On the recommendation of his attorney, Schaefer agreed to a plea bargain. He pleaded guilty to a single count of aggravated assault, with the false imprisonment charge dropped. For this single charge, Judge D.C. Smith sentenced him to 1 year in jail, with the possibility of parole after serving 6 months, followed by 3 years of probation. At the sentencing hearing on December 22nd, Judge Smith did not mince words. He told Schaefer, "It is beyond the court's imagination to conceive how you were such a foolish and astronomic jackass as you were in this case." After court, Schaefer paused outside to speak with reporters. He told them, "I made a stupid mistake. There was no assault involved, no one was hurt." Judge Smith allowed Schaefer's formal incarceration to be postponed until after the holiday season, meaning he would remain free for several more weeks. He did not begin serving his sentence until January 15th, 1973. Between the abduction of Trotter and Wells in July and the end of 1972, 2 additional girls disappeared from the Fort Lauderdale area under circumstances that investigators would later connect to Schaefer. On the evening of October 26, 1972, less than a month after Susan Place and Georgia Jessup vanished, 14-year-old Mary Briscolina and 13-year-old Elsie Farmer were hitchhiking from a motel on Lauderdale by the Sea to a nearby restaurant on Commercial Boulevard. They never arrived. Their bodies were discovered in early 1973, found separately in undergrowth near Sunrise Boulevard in a rural area close to the city of Plantation. Both girls had been found with their legs spread apart, and both had been killed with extreme violence. During the subsequent investigation into the case, detectives spoke to several of Briscolina's friends and acquaintances. A description emerged of a man named Gary Shepard the girls had known. Gary apparently regularly showed up at the apartment rented by the older sister of Briscolina's boyfriend in Lauderdale by the Sea. This individual had told several of the people in that social circle that he was a former Wilton Manors police officer. Several of her acquaintances subsequently identified Gary Shepard as Schaefer from photographs. A distinctive gold chain and a Madonna pin that belonged to Briscolina were later found in Schaefer's possession. Schaefer later privately admitted in prison correspondence that one of his handwritten stories, a piece titled Murder Demons, specifically described and recounted the murders of Briscolina and Farmer. In the weeks following his December 22nd court appearance, and before he began his jail sentence on January 15th, 1973, Schaefer was free and unmonitored over the Christmas holiday period. It was during this window that 15-year-old Suzanne Poole was reported missing from her family's trailer park in Broward County. She vanished without explanation shortly before Christmas. Her case was reported to police, but no connection to Schaefer was made at the time, and the disappearance remained unsolved for nearly 5 decades. On the morning of June 16th, 1974, over a year and a half after Poole's disappearance, a man and his sons discovered skeletal remains in a swampy, wooded stretch of Singer Island in Palm Beach County, an area locally known as Burnt Bridges. The remains were found bound with wire to a mangrove tree. At the time, authorities could not identify the victim, and she was classified as Singer Island Jane Doe. It was not until December 2021 that the sheriff's office submitted the remains to the forensic genealogy company Othram for DNA analysis. The company built a genetic profile, returned investigative leads to the sheriff's office in March 2022, and additional DNA testing of family members confirmed the remains as those of Suzanne Poole. At a press conference held in May 2022, Detective Bill Springer stated that the manner in which Poole's body had been found and the timing of her disappearance made him 99% certain that Schaefer was responsible. Poole had also been reported missing at a time when Schaefer was temporarily freed from court and not yet incarcerated. On January 11, 1973, just 4 days before Schaefer was scheduled to report to Martin County Jail to begin his sentence, 2 more young women disappeared. Colette Goodenough, 19, and Barbara Wilcox, also 19, were both from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The 2 friends had left Sioux City, Iowa, hitchhiking toward Florida. They were last confirmed to have been seen alive in Biloxi, Mississippi. Phone records obtained by investigators showed that Schaefer had placed a long-distance call from Cedar Rapids to his residence in Florida shortly before the women vanished. It remains unknown exactly how or where he encountered them or what the precise circumstances of that encounter were, but investigators believed he had met the women somewhere along their southbound route while he himself was traveling back to Florida. Both women were never seen alive again. Their case became one of the most damning pieces of circumstantial evidence against Schaefer. The driver's license belonging to Barbara Wilcox and the passport belonging to Colette Goodenough were both later recovered from the locked jewelry box found in Schaefer's mother's Fort Lauderdale home. The physical remains of both women were not discovered until January 1977, when their scattered skeletal remains were found near a canal bank in St. Lucie County, close to a large tree and an orange crate. Both women had been bound together with baling wire. Welt impressions on the branches of the tree overhead were consistent with the weight of 1 or more persons having been suspended from it. The orange crate, positioned directly beneath the relevant branches, appeared consistent with having been used as a makeshift stand. Both victims were formally identified through dental records on January 8, 1978. By March 1973, Schaefer had been inside Martin County Jail for approximately 6 weeks. During the same time, Lucille Place was going through her daughter's belongings in her bedroom. That's when she found a letter. It had been tucked among her daughter's things and appeared to have been deliberately hidden. The letter was signed by Jerry Shepard. Lucille went over it carefully. At the bottom of the letter, she found a return address: 333 Martin Avenue, Stuart, Florida. She did not call the police at first. Instead, she got in her car with her husband, Ira, and drove to Stuart. When she arrived at the address, she spoke with the building manager on site. The manager told her that no one named Jerry Shepard had ever been a resident at the property. However, the address had been registered to a man named Gerard Schaefer. The manager informed Lucille that Schaefer had recently been sent to jail for the abduction and attempted hanging of 2 teenage girls. It was here when Lucille began connecting the dots and realized the mistake with the previously mentioned license plate prefixes and their corresponding counties. When she relayed her theory to police and asked them to rerun the plate as a Martin County registration, the result came back instantly. The blue-green 1969 Datsun she had written down was registered to a man named Gerard Schaefer, residing at 333 Martin Avenue, Stuart, Florida. Schaefer was contacted and questioned. He denied without hesitation and with apparent confidence that he had ever met Susan Place, Georgia Jessup, or any member of their families. But when Lucille was shown a photograph taken of Schaefer during his time at the Wilton Manors Police Department, she identified him immediately as the man she had last seen her daughter leave with on the night of September 27, 1972. Then, on the afternoon of Sunday, April 1, 1973, a father and his son were walking through a heavily wooded area of Oak Hammock Park in Port St. Lucie, Florida. They were searching the undergrowth for discarded aluminum cans, which could be turned in for recycling. As they moved deeper into the trees, away from any road or path, they came upon a scene that stopped them cold. The remains of 2 individuals lay scattered in and around a hole that had been dug into the earth among the trees. The grave was positioned approximately 212 feet from the nearest dirt road, deep enough into the wooded area that it would never have been discovered by anyone simply passing along a trail. There was clear evidence that wildlife had disturbed and scattered sections of the remains across a wider area. Deep scratch marks were visible at the base of a large tree immediately alongside the grave. One of the victims was completely nude. A pile of clothing belonging to the deceased was found in the nearby undergrowth, partially obscured by grass that had grown over it. The other victim still wore the remnants of what had once been a pair of blue jeans. About 9 feet from the grave, investigators who arrived at the scene examined a banyan tree. Sections of bark had been worn away from the branches overhead, pressed deep enough to leave lasting impressions. Additionally, a hemp fiber impression in the worn sections of bark was later matched to rope fibers found at the scene. On the trunk of one of the nearby trees, someone had carved the initials GJ into the bark. The location of the graves was approximately 6 miles from the spot on Hutchinson Island where Nancy Trotter and Paula Wells had been tied to trees and nearly hanged the previous July. 4 days later, forensic odontologist Dr. Richard Souviron formally identified both sets of remains as Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. Up to the point of discovery, they had been missing for a total of 190 days. Their spinal cords had been severed at both the lumbar and cervical sections. Several other bones had been completely severed with a blade at multiple points. Both had been decapitated after death, and their jawbones had sustained numerous fractures. The remains of Susan Place bore an additional injury not found on Jessup's, a gunshot wound to the lower jaw inflicted by a .22 caliber pistol. The weapon used was never recovered. Soon after the discovery, investigators obtained search warrants for Schaefer's Martin County residence, his personal vehicle, and the Fort Lauderdale home of his mother. Investigators arrived at Schaefer's rented residence in Stuart, Florida on April 6th. What they found was extensive, though it was the mother's residence that would ultimately yield the more staggering cache of material. In the utility shed attached to the property, investigators located several knives and firearms. In the master bedroom, they found 2 human teeth stored inside a small plastic capsule. The teeth were set aside for forensic examination. An extensively blood-stained white pillowcase was also recovered from the home. There were clear signs that it had been washed numerous times, but the stains were severe enough to remain visible. Perhaps the most immediately significant item recovered from the home was not found in Schaefer's own belongings at all. Instead, it was found in the possession of his wife, Teresa. Officers discovered Georgia Jessup's distinctive suede purse, which Jessup's parents and her younger sister Cheryl had already identified at the trial as belonging to Georgia. Teresa told investigators that her husband had given her the purse as a gift around November of the previous year, which placed the gift roughly 1.5 months after both girls had disappeared in late September. Teresa also revealed something that, in the context of the discovery of the girls' bodies in April, took on enormous significance. After the April 1st discovery, Schaefer had attempted to persuade both Teresa and his brother-in-law Henry Dean to throw the purse away. His stated reason was that the police might find a way to make up some kind of evidence against him using it. Henry Dean, unconvinced, had refused to discard the purse and had instead handed it directly over to police. The search of Schaefer's mother's Fort Lauderdale residence produced a volume and variety of evidence that law enforcement would later describe as the most extensive and disturbing private evidence cache any of them had ever seen. Inside a locked bedroom at the property that functioned as Schaefer's private archive, investigators found about 300 pages of handwritten and typed material, some of which were accompanied by crude hand-drawn illustrations. These were hundreds of stories that depicted in explicit and precise detail the kidnapping, humiliation, assault, torture, and execution of young women. The victims in the stories were constantly referred to in demeaning ways. The narratives described Schaefer forcing victims to consume beer or wine while they stood on makeshift stands with nooses around their necks, watching them involuntarily urinate as the rope tightened. Some stories described his returning to burial sites weeks or months after the killings to commit acts of with decomposed or dismembered remains, or to extract teeth from the skulls of victims. Multiple narratives reflected a deep fascination with historical methods of torture and execution. Several of the stories bore names strikingly familiar to investigators working active missing persons cases in the area. Two named victims in the stories, Belinda and Carmen, corresponded to women who had been reported missing. Another story described the hanging of an unidentified woman at a location close to Powerline Road, a specific stretch of roadway in Broward County. Also found at the residence were 11 firearms of various types, bags of both live and spent cartridges, 13 hunting knives, and multiple sections of rope. Scores of softcore adult magazines were recovered, all of which Schaefer had modified himself. Using handwriting, drawn over imagery, and physical alterations, he had transformed the standard photographs into images depicting the women in increasingly disturbing scenarios. 37 black and white Polaroid photographs were also recovered. The images depicted women being hanged or mutilated, typically set within wooded areas believed by investigators to be located in Davie, Florida, a suburban area south of Fort Lauderdale. The focus quality of some of the photographs was too poor to positively identify all subjects depicted. Additional photographs depicted Schaefer himself, dressed in women's garments, simulating his own hanging from a tree with fecal matter smeared across his body. A letter dated July 20th, 1971 was found among the materials, written by a man in Brunswick, East Victoria, Australia, whom Schaefer had befriended while traveling in Morocco in the summer of 1970. The letter came with a large number of Polaroids, described by the correspondent as images of a village in the Sahara the two had visited following what he described as a Wog massacre of both European and Arab individuals. Several of these photographs depicted women who had been extensively disemboweled and mutilated. Inside a gold jewelry box, investigators found what would become the most directly incriminating material in the entire property search. A collection of personal belongings taken from women and girls, including jewelry, passports, driver's licenses, diaries, and clothing items. Several items could not be immediately matched to any specific missing or murdered individual, but others were rapidly identified as belonging to known victims, such as a gold locket inscribed with the name Lee, which was identified to belong to 24-year-old Lee Bonadies. She was Schaefer's neighbor when both were teenagers and who had been missing since September 1969. Lee had told her husband she had been offered a position with the CIA by a contact she knew and had left to meet someone on September 8, 1969. Her car was later found abandoned in a Fort Lauderdale parking lot. Schaefer, when questioned at the time, claimed she had asked him for a ride to the airport, but had never called back to confirm a departure time, leading him to assume she had changed her plans. Her skull, bearing 3 bullet holes, was eventually found at a construction site in Palm Beach County in 1978. The 2 teeth in the plastic capsule were later linked to a 22-year-old named Carmen Halleck. Carmen was a cocktail waitress from Broward County who had disappeared on December 18, 1969. She had met with her sister-in-law for lunch and told her she was excited about a date she had planned for that evening. The man she was going out with, she said, was a teacher who had offered her a position doing some kind of undercover work for the government that involved international travel and substantial pay. She left for the date that evening and never returned. By Christmas Day, her family had not heard from her. When they used a spare key to enter her apartment, they found her dog locked inside, unfed, and the bathtub filled with water as though she had started preparing a bath and suddenly left. Her car was found in a parking lot shortly after, and her body was never recovered. By May 12, 1973, investigators in Broward and Martin counties had cross-referenced the evidence from the 2 search warrants with existing missing persons reports and active homicide investigations. By this date, they had gathered sufficient physical and circumstantial evidence to formally connect Schaefer to 9 murders and unsolved disappearances dating between 1969 and 1973. Shortly thereafter, a list of 28 murdered or missing persons believed to have some connection to Schaefer was published. The majority of individuals on the list were from Florida, but the list included 2 victims, each from Iowa and West Virginia. Investigators later acknowledged that the list was imperfect, but at its core, it reflected the frightening scope of Schaefer's crimes. On May 18, 1973, Schaefer was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the killings of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. He was held without bond pending trial. Following his formal charging, he was transferred to the Florida State Hospital in Chattahoochee for a mandatory 30-day period of psychiatric examination prior to trial. The results of the evaluation were documented on June 20th, 1973 in a report authored by Dr. Benjamin R. Ogburn. Dr. Ogburn described Schaefer as an individual suffering from paranoia, psychosis, and acute intimate deviation. The report documented that Schaefer harbored a specific ideological framework around his actions, that he viewed himself as an eliminator of women he deemed immoral. Most importantly, the evaluation deemed him mentally competent to stand trial. Schaefer's murder trial began on September 17, 1973 in St. Lucie County before Judge Trowbridge. As the murders had been committed during a period when capital punishment was constitutionally suspended in Florida, prosecutors sought life imprisonment rather than the death penalty. Schaefer pleaded not guilty and sat throughout the proceedings with a cold, aloof demeanor, often staring blankly at witnesses or turning to smile at members of the press. The jury deliberated for just over 5 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on both counts of first-degree murder on October 4th, 1973. When asked if he wished to say anything before sentencing, Schaefer again insisted on his innocence and requested to be transferred to a psychiatric facility. Both requests were denied. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms at Florida State Prison. And on a bizarre footnote, Schaefer's defense attorney, Elton Schwartz, married Schaefer's second wife, Teresa, in December 1973, immediately after the conviction. When Schaefer entered prison, he immediately established himself as a combative, manipulative, and disruptive inmate. Many fellow prisoners suspected him of being a police informant, placing him in a dangerous position within prison. He was also sent to solitary confinement multiple times in the early years for violating rules, including attempting to solicit women outside the prison to mail him underwear. Schaefer spent the majority of his time in prison writing. He developed what he called a new literary genre he termed killer fiction. These were graphic first-person narratives of kidnapping, torture, assault, and murder, typically written from the perspective of a rogue police officer. He publicly maintained these stories were inspired by exploitation horror films, specifically citing Herschel Gordon Lewis's 1963 film Blood Feast. He insisted that they were purely fictional. Police and prosecutors viewed them as thinly veiled confessions. In private conversations with his attorneys, Schaefer eventually confirmed the speculation, admitting that at least one story directly described his real murders. In 1983, he was transferred to the Avon Park Correctional Institution, where he provided investigators with evidence that helped convict Mervyn Eric Cross, a pedophile running an international operation from within prison exploiting children. The information Schaefer supplied led to the arrest of 2 additional perpetrators, including a schoolteacher, and the seizure of thousands of indecent images across 4 states. He returned to Florida State Prison in August 1985. In 1990, true crime author and former high school girlfriend Sandra London published Killer Fiction, a compilation of Schaefer's prison stories and drawings. A second volume, Beyond Killer Fiction, followed in 1992. The collections were highly controversial, and former FBI profiler Robert Ressler described the content as, quote, right on target to what happens in serial homicides. Former FBI agent Bill Haggerty, who had interviewed serial killers across the country, placed Schaefer in his top 5 most disturbing list. Sandra London eventually ended her collaboration with Schaefer, publicly rejecting his claim that he was simply a framed ex-cop. Upon hearing of her public rebuke, Schaefer allegedly threatened her life repeatedly. He then sued her for publicly calling him a serial killer in print, one of many lawsuits he filed from prison. London compiled 500 handwritten, incriminating pages of his correspondence in support of her defense, and the judge immediately dismissed Schaefer's lawsuit. Schaefer also sued authors Colin Wilson, Michael Newton, and former FBI agent Robert Ressler for referring to him as a serial killer, and sued true crime writer Patrick Kendrick after Kendrick described him in a letter as, quote, a middle-aged, pale, and doughy wimp who preyed on victims that were physically and psychologically weaker than him. These lawsuits were all dismissed or settled unfavorably for Schaefer. In private letters published posthumously in a revised edition of Killer Fiction, Schaefer wrote to London claiming to have been in the ghoul game for almost 10 years by the time he abducted Place and Jessup in 1972. He claimed Ted Bundy admired and envied him, dismissing Bundy as playing a copycat. In separate correspondence, Schaefer claimed his personal list of victims exceeded 80 and that he had begun killing women at age 19 in 1965. He also wrote letters confessing to the 1969 kidnapping and cannibalization of 2 young girls from Pompano Beach, referring to Peggy Ron and Wendy Stevenson, though this particular claim is considered unreliable, as eyewitness descriptions of a man seen with the girls do not match Schaefer's physical description. Throughout his imprisonment, Schaefer maintained his public stance of complete innocence while simultaneously writing private confessions. He harassed victims' families through letters, made threats against witnesses, and continued to falsely and maliciously characterize Susan Place and Georgia Jessup as substance users and police informants. On December 3, 1995, a fellow inmate at Florida State Prison informed guards that something was wrong. Schaefer was found dead on the floor of his cell. He had been stabbed over 40 times in the face, head, neck, and body. He was pronounced dead at 49 years old. A 32-year-old inmate named Vincent Rivera was identified as the killer. Prison officials publicly stated that an argument over a final cup of hot water had triggered the attack. However, investigators suspected the true motive was Schaefer's status as an informant, specifically that he had provided confidential information to authorities about a well-respected and powerful inmate. In the year leading up to his death, other inmates had thrown human waste at him and set his prison cell on fire on 2 separate occasions. Rivera was convicted of the murder in 1999, but never confessed and never publicly stated a motive. Schaefer's sister, Sarah, told reporters she believed the killing was connected to her brother's promised cooperation with detectives investigating the 1981 abduction and murder of 6-year-old Adam Walsh, and his claimed knowledge about confessed perpetrator Otis Toole. Schaefer had not been scheduled for release until 2018, but his family had hoped his cooperation in multiple ongoing investigations would result in early parole. At the time of Schaefer's death, Broward County homicide detectives were actively preparing to bring additional murder charges against him in at least 3 separate cases. Officially, Schaefer was convicted of 2 murders. His own private correspondence claimed over 80 victims, though many investigators treat these boasts with skepticism, noting the tendency among some killers to exaggerate kill counts. The true number will never be known with certainty.